Well, it's a great pleasure to be here at the Foundation. That was a hard act to follow. But I want to thank Prime Minister Aznar for inviting me back again. He has been a great leader of Spain, a great leader of the West as a whole, and a great friend. And his remarks, I think, really go to issues that will be dealt with in Spain, but across the West as a whole. Different in different countries, but reflecting many of the same problems. I'd like to talk a little bit about the global situation that we all face, which is more turbulent, more dangerous, and more unpredictable than it's been in a long time, really since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Warsaw Pact. We are now past the post-Cold War era. Cold War ended in 1991. Post-Cold War era since then has been a confused and troubling time, but now we add to it the risks and threats that we ignored for too long. This is something that all of us need to adjust to, the United States, the European Union, what I call the global West, our friends in Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, all across the world. That is the global West. And what we face is a growing axis between China and Russia. It reminds us of the Sino-Soviet alliance of the Cold War, but this time, China is obviously the dominant partner. This axis is not fully formed. It has internal problems, to be sure, but it continues to grow in strength and cohesiveness. It has its outriders, its satellites, if you will, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Belarus, and in the Western Hemisphere, what I called the troika of tyranny, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. This is an axis which threatens us on a global basis. What look to be individual conflicts in disparate parts of the world are increasingly part of a common pattern that we can see continuing to emerge as time goes by. And let me just run through some of those conflicts to help show why this new axis is something that requires collective action by the West in response, and that ad hoc, episodic treatments of this growing problem will leave us weaker and our friends and our allies around the world in graver danger. Starting right here in Europe, which we had hoped after 1945 would not see armed conflict, but which now has the largest war since World War II. This was a war of unprovoked aggression by Russia against Ukraine. This was not a conflict that anybody in the West sought, but it was a conflict that the weakness of the West failed to deter. Weakness by our collective failure in 2014 to respond effectively to the first unprovoked Russian aggression. Failure to enact sanctions after that was over, failure to take adequate steps to defend Ukraine, failure that was predicted even before that when in 2008 President George W. Bush proposed bringing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO on an expedited basis, and France and Germany basically rejected it. Putting those countries behind a NATO border might have prevented the aggressions that we saw in 2008, 2014, and 2022. Finland and Sweden clearly believe that, abandoning 75 years of neutrality to become NATO members, one of the great unforeseen consequences of the Kremlin's action. The response of the West to the Russian invasion in February of 2022 has been directionally correct. We oppose the invasion, but operationally flawed, and has resulted in 2.5 years of standoff between Ukraine and Russia. We have delivered enormous assistance to Ukraine collectively, but we have not done it in a strategic fashion. Every NATO member is committed to the proposition that we want the full restoration of sovereignty and territorial integrity for Ukraine, but we have not acted to make that happen. And what comes next is very hard to see, principally because of a potential outcome of the presidential election in the United States, where one of the contenders has basically said that he thinks he can solve the problem between Russia and Ukraine in 24 hours, and he would get Presidents Zelensky and Putin in a room together, and it would all be taken care of. Well, that isn't going to happen. But the risk is that if Donald Trump is elected president, he will move in the direction of the man he thinks is his friend, Vladimir Putin, to Ukraine's great detriment. This is something I wish I could give you a clear prediction of what's going to happen, but I can't. The election in the United States is very close. I'm happy to disclose what I'm going to do. I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump. I'm not going to vote for Kamala Harris. I don't like either choice. It's going to be a tough 4 years for the United States, and I wish I could give you better news, but it's something I think Spain and Europe more broadly should be thinking about. I have more worries about what might come next if Trump wins. He has said on multiple occasions that he would withdraw the United States from NATO. I think this would be a catastrophic mistake, and many people say he won't do it. After all, they say, he didn't withdraw in his first term as president. I could give you a long explanation of why that didn't happen. I'll simply say I was in the room with him at the NATO summit in Brussels in 2018. In fact, I was the last person to speak to him before he gave a speech where he came very close to withdrawing from NATO. Right before he spoke, he called me up to the big NATO conference table and said, well, what should we do? What should we do? I said, go up to the line, but don't go over it, which fortunately is what he did. I'm not taking credit for it. I got lucky that day. It's going to be very important to find ways to avoid Trump withdrawing from NATO if he's elected. And I wish I could give a clear answer as to how to do that. I think distracting him for 4 years is the best way to do it. But there's enormous damage that can be done here. Damage to the United States as much as to Europe. The one thing I think Europe could do is to try and help prove what should be obvious, which is that NATO benefits the United States as much as the United States benefits NATO. A working, functioning collective defense organization makes everybody more secure. And if any of you have better ways to explain that to Donald Trump, I urge you to try, because if you could make the case more persuasively than others of us have made it, that would safeguard the alliance. And this obviously has ramifications elsewhere, as many have noticed. But in Europe in particular, there are other non-NATO countries that could be threatened by further Russian aggression. Never forget that in 2005, Vladimir Putin said the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And what he's doing, not recreating the Soviet Union, he's recreating the Russian Empire. And we either stand against that, or he'll simply continue, not necessarily against NATO members, but against the Caucasus countries, against the Central Asian republics, against Moldova. This can be a truly tragic error if we don't respond effectively. In the Middle East, we see the unfolding of what could be a region-wide war, which really, at this moment, is a region-wide war, directed and controlled by the Ayatollahs in Tehran, one of the outriders of the Russia-China axis. They are implementing right now what they themselves call the Ring of Fire strategy. This is not simply a conflict between the Palestinians from Gaza and Israel. This is a region-wide effort by Iran to damage what they call the little Satan, Israel, but which would be applicable to the Gulf Arab states as well. Iran has created a network of terrorist proxies that are all working in concert in the Ring of Fire strategy. The strategy may not be going very well for Iran, but that's what's unfolding. From the Houthis in Yemen, who wouldn't have two rocks to rub together if the Iranians didn't supply them with missiles and drones, who have cut off substantially the Suez Canal, Red Sea, commercial traffic, one of the most important sea lanes in the world, and we have not responded effectively. Hamas in Gaza, conducting one of the most barbaric attacks in contemporary civilization on October the 7th, another proxy of Iran. Right now, where the focus is today, literally, between Hezbollah and Israel, Hezbollah has gotten from Iran directly or financed by Iran what the CIA has publicly estimated to be at least 150,000 missiles, which it could use to attack Israel. In Syria and Iraq, Shia militia groups formed by Iran have threatened American military and civilian personnel, conducting 170 attacks since October the 7th, the date of the Hamas barbarity against Israel. And then, of course, there's Iran itself with its conventional capabilities and its decades-long program to get deliverable nuclear weapons. The terrorist groups have been armed, equipped, trained, and directed by Iran. This is not a gratuitous act by Iran. They didn't do it to make the terrorist groups happy. They created and fostered these groups to be at the direction of Iran. And that's what's happening now. It's a brutal conflict and tells us just what terrorists are. Not only do they commit acts of barbarity against Israel and other countries, they brutalize their own people. They use them as human shields. They violate the laws of war by storing weapons and arms and armed units in schools and hospitals and mosques. They're the ones that make it impossible for the Palestinian people and others to have any kind of expectation for their future. And make no mistake, the stakes here for China and Russia are enormous. Iran is supplying Russia with drones to use against Ukraine. It's supplying oil to China, as is Russia, in increasing amounts. This axis is growing more close in its coordination of positions, really, on a whole range of things. And it's the Middle East that's the focus of Iran today. It's not a series of individual conflicts. And while, again, I think directionally we have done the right thing in saying we will support Israel's right to self-defense, it's not enough just to maintain your existence. It's not enough just to live through it. The Israelis, as we would be if we were in their circumstance, are entitled to eliminate the terrorist threat. That is real self-defense. That's what the United States did in World War II. Our demand of our opponents in that war was unconditional surrender. That's what Israel's entitled to from Hamas and the others. And then on the Indo-Pacific front with China, the leader of this new axis, a country that was misestimated by the West for decades, thinking it would develop into a responsible stakeholder in world affairs, that it would engage in a peaceful rise, when in fact it's engaged in one of the most significant military buildups in human history. A country where we said as economic growth creates a new middle class, we'll have a spread of democracy. Another fundamental mistake. China now has the most autocratic government since Mao Zedong. And it's doing two things. I could spend a lot of time on China, but two things that it's critical in Europe, if I may say, need to be understood. Number one, China's engaged in, as part of its general military buildup, a significant increase in its nuclear weapons capability. Projections are that perhaps in 5 years they will have 700 strategic nuclear weapons. That could be a low estimate. Under the New START treaty, Russia and the United States are limited to 1,550 deliverable weapons each. China has refused to engage in arms control negotiations because it intends to get up to or very close to the levels of Russia and the United States. That sounds dangerous, it is, but here's the reason why. All of the defenses, all of our deterrence strategy, all of our thinking about nuclear weapons capability is intended not to have to fight a nuclear war. But you can't deter your adversaries unless they think you've got the capability to do it and the resolve to do it. So for decades, some of the finest minds in America worked on deterrence theory. And fortunately, we made it through the Cold War, probably the most dangerous period in history where exchanges of nuclear salvos could have eliminated civilization in the Northern Hemisphere. But now, this Chinese effort to reach parity with Russia and the United States is creating a tripolar nuclear world. And all of the theories about deterrence that worked when it was one against one don't work when it's one and one and one. This is a threat that people don't fully realize, but it puts China in an extraordinarily powerful position even as its population begins to decline and even as its economy begins to decline. The second thing that China is doing is not simply threatening Taiwan, it is now challenging the entire First Island chain in East Asia, which extends from the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia down to the Malay Peninsula in Southeast Asia. You can look on it on a map if it's not a concept familiar to you. Once you see that line of islands that constitute the First Island chain, you will never forget it. Within the past few months, China has gone from interfering in Taiwan's maritime domain and airspace into penetrating Japan's maritime domain and airspace. It obviously has been at work in the South China Sea for the last 10 to 15 years. China claims sovereignty over 80% of the South China Sea, turning what have historically been international sea lanes into Chinese territorial waters by their description. Now, we contest that. We will work together, and you may have seen the announcement yesterday by the Quad, India, Japan, Australia, and China, to coordinate better on Coast Guard matters against these kinds of incursions. But China is probing the First Island chain. It needs to break through that to get to the broader Pacific, and it affects everybody in East, Southeast, and South Asia. So these are just some indications of the kinds of threats that China has been increasing. And in the Western Hemisphere, this axis of Russia and China in particular manifested itself in Cuba and in Venezuela and in Nicaragua. You know, I would say the greatest disappointment of my time as National Security Advisor was our failure to help the people of Venezuela retake control of their government from the Chavez-Maduro dictatorship. We tried. We thought that the people had done all that they could without outside intervention. You know, it's a sensitive matter in the Western Hemisphere when the United States acts, but there was no doubt in our mind that the citizens of Venezuela wanted a different kind of government. And you've seen what happened when the Biden administration made a deal with Maduro to modify the sanctions in exchange for free and fair elections. It was a deal that was never going to happen. Maduro was never going to conduct free and fair elections. The only hope for the people of Venezuela is to bring down this dictatorship and allow the country, which could be one of the wealthiest in the Western Hemisphere, the chance to get back on its feet. So what are the prescriptions that we all need to follow? The first is, for the West, the first is hard for politicians, but is a reality. We're going to have to increase defense spending considerably. Now, in the United States, we're running record deficits. As the Prime Minister said, that's not a road to economic stability or economic growth. So it's a matter of arithmetic. If you need to spend more on defense, we're going to have to spend less on domestic programs. And spend even less in order to get budget deficits down and therefore the national debt down. But that is the circumstance we face because of the threats, the extent of the threats we face around the world. Right now, the United States spends about 3% of its GDP on defense matters. European countries in NATO have been moving closer to 2%. Which was the 2014 agreed target at the Cardiff NATO summit. Here's the bad news. I think the United States needs to go back to Reagan-era defense spending levels, which is in the range of 5 to 6% of GDP. It is inevitable that we will ask Europe to come to something like 4%. Japan has said, under outgoing Prime Minister Kishida, it will double its defense spending in 5 years from 1% to 2% of GDP. If you assume their GDP is rising, that will be more than doubling in real dollar terms. It will make Japan the third largest military in the world after the United States and China. That's really quite something for our World War II adversary, now our ally, to be such a prominent player. But it reflects the world as it is, and we need Europe to be thinking about doing the same thing. And there's another proposal that I want to leave you with that I think I put in the category of being the best unused idea of the 20th century, and it's Prime Minister Aznar's idea to expand NATO and make it a global alliance. Why? Because we now face a global threat from the China-Russia axis. When he first proposed the idea, as I recall, he suggested that NATO make membership offers to Japan, Australia, Singapore, and Israel, among others. That's a good place to start. And I think European countries have to understand that they live not just in a European world. We live in a world where the threat is something that can be played out in many different areas. If, as it looks like, Russia's status in the China-Russia axis continues to diminish, China's sway will increase, and the European Union will find it has China on its border. So we can either do this now and get ready for it, or we can suffer the consequences later if we don't. I hope we all make the right choice. Thank you very much.